Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this session on energy access. Sorry for the delay, but so we will have even more your attention. I'm Anna Creti, Professor of Economics at Dauphine University and Director of the Climate Economics Chair. We are going to discuss something that has been already mentioned yesterday in the opening session by Professor Miguel. Whether there are different angles also to tackle this problem of energy access. On one side, making progress, in particular in the areas where this access is not granted yet. And on the same time, understanding a question that has been raised yesterday, that is, which are the returns of accessing energy, both for the households and perhaps in segments where we know less, where the usage also of electricity and energy more in general is part of the production process. So he mentioned, Professor Miguel yesterday mentioned also industrial consumers, hospitals, and on this last point, which is very important in the after COVID crisis. So today we will have this broad discussion with three colleagues and distinguished scholars. Jörg Peters is going to open the floor, followed by Ignacio Pérez-Arriaga and Federico Pontoni. So we will discuss this issue both on the economic literature, but also I would say in the reality and how different or difficult it is really on the practical experiences. So without delaying more, please, Jörg, I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Anna, for having me. Yes, let me start by saying that it's very unfortunate that we are not meeting in person in Paris, of course. And in the meantime, I share my screen. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes, awesome. Right, so I'm going to talk about basically what the literature says on the impacts of electrification in rural areas, mostly in rural Africa. That's where I'm focusing on. So on the impacts of rural electrification on economic development, basically. And I like to refer to this project as sort of like a coping with my academic midlife crisis, if you will. So I've spent most of my professional life and hence considerable parts of my life in general on studying this question. And recently there have been a number of systematic reviews. Sorry. There have been a number of systematic reviews that take stock basically of that literature, of which I am also part of. I will basically review these reviews in this presentation, in this paper, and try to digest what they say. And as a spoiler, I come to the conclusion that there is no clear picture and that this actually raises some concerns about the evidence-based policy paradigm in general. Maybe that's, of course, kind of a provocative statement. Let's see whether you agree or at least buy some of my points or not. Some of you might remember that somewhere in the mid-2000s, and by the way, I'm mostly talking about the economic literature here, right? So in econ journals, etc., as you will see. And in economics, there was, so in the mid-2000s, there was what we like to call something like the credibility revolution of empirical economics, which was part of the, a movement that you might call the evidence-based policy paradigm. Basically, the idea was to, if we conduct rigorous studies that succeed in identifying causal relationships, we can eventually improve policy. And there were a number of very influential papers and, and books and all this, both from academia and leading scholars, but also from, let's say, at the interface between policy and academia. So for electrification, that's a very general movement, this evidence-based policy movement, and the credibility revolution obviously refer to economics in general, or empirical science in general. And we in the energy access community did as we were told, I would say, now looking back at the last 15, 16 years. So we have conducted dozens of rigorous impact evaluations, not only me, obviously, but also other teams and colleagues on the question of whether electrification leads to economic development or not, roughly speaking. Now I use a quote from Esther Duflo, who cautions that, obviously each experiment or quasi-experiment is only like a dot on the pointillist painting. So on its own, it does not mean much. It's the accumulation of results that eventually paints a picture that might help, making sense of the world and eventually guide policy. So in this paper, I tried to ask, so what does the pointillist painting for this specific research question actually tell the policymaker? So this is just kind of a summary slide. So a few messages and questions that you might take away or chew on. So first off, systematic reviews, that's what I'm looking at here, are the go-to approach to synthesize evidence. But what do we do if there is no clear picture, like if there's no clear pointillist painting basically that emerges? And also, as a side note, there is no, in economics, there is no like established culture of conducting systematic reviews. So it's hardly being done actually, or maybe only recently people have started doing this. And the method is also not, let's say, very well established and trained and etc. in economics, which is also important to bear in mind. And then I would like to point out that so in literatures in general, there is huge heterogeneity across contexts. So it's very difficult to transfer whatever credible evidence you have in context A to context B. And this is very important for the policy takeaways. And I would also like to raise a few concerns about the replication crisis, as some people say. So what if the reproducibility of studies or non-reproducibility of studies is actually correlated with the policy under evaluation? In this particular case, I will raise some concerns that maybe on-grid electrification studies are, let's say, more discussable than off-grid ones, because different methods are being used in studying them. I'm going to skip that, time reasons. Just probably most people in this audience are familiar with the topic, so just a few, like I will rush through the next 2-3 slides just to give you a little bit of background on the question. So most of you will know that like close to 1 billion people in the global south, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, are lacking access to reliable electricity. And the big policy question maybe is, should there be a big push for grid extension, or should especially rural Africa maybe leapfrog the grid, right, and go off grid directly? And this is obviously related to costs also, but also expected impacts, because off-grid solutions are less expensive, but also less powerful. Just to talk about how much is the fish. So there is really a lot at stake in terms of donor or governmental budgets. So there are some estimates, official estimates, if you will, from OECD, etc., that the costs like really accrue to accumulate to something like close to 3% of Africa's GDP annually to reach universal access. And therefore, the question, what are the socio-economic effects of different types of rural electrification, are extremely important for policy to take informed decisions about, for example, whether to go for an off-grid solution or an on-grid solution. Yeah, as most of you will know, the heterogeneity across contexts is huge in terms of access rates, current access rates. This is just Africa, and trends are also differing. So West Africa East Africa is particularly rapid in reaching the universal access goal, and Central Africa is particularly slow. Anyway, so that's just to give you an idea of where we are in terms of the problem, if you will. Now, as I briefly mentioned, in the last 2, 3, 4 years, there have been like really a number of quasi-systematic reviews, some of them more systematic than others, on electrification. So studies that look at studies that have been conducted on this question. In this paper, I'm going to review these reviews with respect to what they find in terms of economic development impacts. So as you see here, it's really like there are 10-ish or so studies that raise this question. And I think it's fair to say that virtually all of them, without going into any detail here now, diagnose a divide in the literature, which means that sometimes studies find very, very large impacts of electrification and sometimes very, very sobering ones, sobering impacts of electrification. So this paper, my paper here, tries to first emphasize the risks, the risk that this divide entails for the evidence-based policy paradigm. Unless, I will argue, unless we understand this divide better. So what I try to do is to distill different narratives that are provided in these reviews. And I will additionally ponder a couple of further explanations for why literature might come up with this divided picture. So now I will very briefly summarize 3 or 4 of these reviews just to give you an idea of what they do and what they find. So if you will, from a policy perspective, what does the evidence say? So this review, I was also co-author, but it was mostly conducted by my colleagues and friends from Duke University and the CETI, the Sustainable Energy Transition Initiative. And this one basically takes stock of the literature. It is very methodologically inclusive, so it did not throw out certain studies in literature for certain methodological reasons, etc. And maybe the key message here is that the number of studies in the literature is huge, right? And now you can imagine being a systematic reviewer, you have a lot of leeway and difficult decisions to take, which of these you include and which you exclude. So now, one example for a narrative that is provided for the divided impact findings in literature is a methodological one. So for example, this paper by Johannes Opelein and his colleagues states that it's especially randomized designs that lead to, more modest impacts or observe more modest impacts, whereas observational findings, as they claim, are maybe upward, observe bigger impacts because they have an upward bias, basically for methodological reasons, and it makes a very strong claim for RCT, randomized control trials, RCTs. On a similar note, this paper, it's not really a systematic review, but also tries to take a look at the existing evidence by Catherine Wolfram and her colleagues from Berkeley. So this paper ponders, also constitutes or states this divide that I mentioned, and then ponders various explanations without taking a clear position on what is behind the divide. It also points out that, like, at the methodological difference between studies, and pointing out that some, especially grid extension studies, are using geographic instrumental variables, and they raise concerns about that method. And I will come back to this in a few slides. So that's narrative A, or one methodological divide between papers. Another one is a regional divide. So again, another study by Johannes Opelein and colleagues states that there is hardly any, or there's not much evidence from African countries. Most of the evidence is coming from Southeast Asia and Latin America. And as we also pointed out, Maxi, my colleague Maxi and I, this evidence from Latin America and Southeast Asia might not be transferable to the African context. So that's the second narrative that is put forward in a couple of systematic reviews, the regional divide. So now I will try to ponder some further explanations that are not yet, at least not explicitly made, or let's say prominently made in these systematic reviews. This is now, if you will, my personal reading of the literature. I think especially for on-grid electrification, these studies are mostly in all, but I think 3 or 4 cases based on secondary data, and this comes with some irks and quirks. So many of these studies use instrumental variables or diff and diff. And it's, I would not say it's not established, but there are concerns that this type of these methods more often come with, publication bias and p-hacking problems, let's say. So let's maybe zoom into two studies that are probably, at least in the economics literature, the most influential ones. Both look at on-grid electrification and both use instrumental variables. This is a study on Brazil by Lipscomb et al. And another one by Terran Dinkelman in South Africa. And both are based on some sort of geographic variation as source of, as a source for identification. And by coincidence, we replicated both of them. So meaning we reanalyzed them using their own data. And just, to walk you quickly through what we find there is, so again, they try to use geographic variation as an exogenous source. And what our replication for the Dinkelman paper showed is that, the IV, so in her case, it's the land gradient. It also drives electrification in, the outcome variable, female employment here, in unconnected areas. So this is sort of a placebo test, if you will, and this should not be the case, ideally. It also drives road access, so it's very difficult to argue that geographic variation only affects, one type of infrastructure, here electrification, and not the other. For example, roads, which is also what we show in our comment. And also the IV is weak by all standards, which especially the interaction of these like problematic exclusion restriction and weakness leads to very, basically to, So I would say it's fair to say, so I don't know if everybody would agree, if everybody agreed that Dinkelman study is, let's say, I wouldn't claim to destroy it, right? But I think it's very difficult to interpret the original results, at least much more difficult than the original paper claimed. And for the Lipscomb et al. Study, it's similar, even though the problems that we diagnose are different. So here we, and this is not yet published, we are trying to publish this in collaboration with the original authors. So here we found a mistake in the original study, and it's related to how they deal with the Amazon region, where it's not much is happening there in this region. And once you basically correct that mistake, the results become insignificant. And now we are trying to figure out what is actually going on. And there is no clear consensus, let's say, between the authors and us on how to basically interpret the new results. It's ongoing work, and I might come up with a published version of this that is that has a different message. So that's work in progress. But I think so currently I think that again it's difficult to come up with a clear interpretation of the original results. Okay, so let's get away from this IV debate and back to the evidence-based policy interface. But I do think it's important to at least shed some more light on how complicated it is to use this method and how debatable it is. Because I think there is a risk, because policymakers, of course, have certain interests in how they use evidence. And there's a nice paper, not on electrification, but in general, on how policymakers update their beliefs by Aidan Covell and Eva Wiewald, and what they demonstrate, or is for certain examples how policymakers use evidence. And to take a step back, the evidence-based policy paradigm has also made inroads into donor organizations like international development banks, etc. So, which means that if you are a staff member of such an organization, you need to demonstrate for certain decisions that there is evidence that this is a worthwhile investment. So you have to come up with some sort of IRR or ERR, which of course has to draw upon the evidence that is out there. And this might happen in a way that you basically pick the evidence in a wishful extrapolation way. That's a term coined by Czarmansky. So policymakers tend to screen evidence for confirmative findings. And the divided electrification literature basically lends itself for this wishful extrapolation because it has something to offer for every agenda. For example, a solar proponent might use the very disappointing evidence on on-grid electrification to justify more investment into solar, whereas infrastructure or on-grid proponents can easily refer to very enthusiastic on-grid evidence, for example, the IV-based studies that I pointed at earlier. So we therefore, that's what I would contend, we therefore must improve our understanding of the heterogeneity in the existing evidence. And some further pretty fundamental introspection. So our impact evaluations are even able to inform policy. And again, referring to some work by Eva Wiewald, who tries to think like a Bayesian, which I also increasingly try to do. So not going into the details now, but she tries to, for different literatures, also electrification, she tries to synthesize the evidence using a Bayesian hierarchical modeling approach, which basically tries to look at the correlation between different studies to ask whether, like, how far off are we if we use existing evidence to predict, expected impacts in new settings. And I think in a nutshell, response to this question is that that the risk is very high, especially for electrification, which is basically because the heterogeneity between contexts is so high. So for electrification, in her case, or according to her findings, it's not so. Looking at the evidence is not much better than flipping a coin if you are up for predicting the sign of the effect in a new setting. So a few concluding remarks, maybe some of them are still controversial, I guess. I think I would like to emphasize that generalization in any case across contexts is not possible unless we increase the number of studies, but now we have done so for 15 years. So how much more evidence do we need? How many more studies do we need? Another 15 years before we know what to do. And we have to be much more specific about the contextual heterogeneities, which we hardly do in rigorous studies, or not enough for my taste. And we should maybe try to separate the wheat from the chaff. So we need replications and reanalyses of all kinds, I think, to improve our understanding of what's going on in the existing literature and evidence. Yeah, in general, I also think we also, as the academic community, we should caution much more explicitly against the misuse of single pieces of evidence in the policy debate, and not write, concluding sections that generalize to basically the entire developing world. And I'm clearly also part of that, I admit. And in general, I believe that basically we should fine-tune our epistemic paradigm and move away from generalization across contexts and more to a regionally limited tinkering approach, as I would coin it. So basically working with programs in a certain setting and doing a sequence of studies. I think that's maybe a promising way forward to really make use of evidence. But that would then mean that we do not generalize whatever we observe in Senegal to Kenya or even India, right? Just to give an example. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And please reach out directly after this presentation or via email, on Twitter or whatever. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jörg, for this very comprehensive review. Yet a little bit critical, but it was done on purpose. So we may have some questions from the floor before we move on. So you can write it on the chat. They will be forwarded to us, or we can take them later. Still, the good news is that this topic is attracting attention. So even if, as you say, multiplying the the case studies is perhaps not the best way to make progress, but we see more and more publications on this issue.
Perhaps a question.
Yes, please.
Good morning. I'm Alexis. I'm a PhD in energy economics. I'm working on sub-Saharan countries. Thanks for your presentation, Mr. Peters. I just want to know why sub-Saharan African countries are so special. Because we see that the no access to electricity is only concentrated now. All developing countries tend to reach universal access. You see South Asia, you see Asia on the wall, but no sub-Saharan countries. Why still this problem still remains in sub-Saharan countries? I quote some examples. There is successful countries in East Africa like Kenya, or in West Africa like Ghana, Ivory Coast. So why we have still a problem in sub-Saharan Africa? Is it because electricity supply? Is it because electric companies develop a model that is not doing well, and we have to introduce a private producer in order to increase installed capacity? Why this continent is so special?
Yeah, thanks for this question. It's obviously a very good one, but certainly even more difficult to answer. At least it's very complex. I think some of the responses you have pointed at yourself already. I think on a very general level, I would raise the good versus bad governance response. But let me maybe allow to zoom back into what I presented, right? So, and let's talk about the impacts of electrification, also because it's maybe a bit easier to answer, but still complex enough. I think so. If you look at the papers that are out there on Latin American countries and Southeast Asian countries, these are studies on countries that were on a very on a steep growth path, if you will, and then electrification infrastructure came in on top, right? And certainly it was also important that it came in on top, because otherwise these countries might have not grown further. But that's a completely different question than connecting a rural area in Africa, or also in Asian countries today, that so far have not, kind of started some endogenous growth process, right? And then I think it's maybe even naive, or at least I would say it's not justified to expect that electrification will kind of kick these regions out of poverty. And I think that's maybe an inference fallacy that has been made in the literature, or by policymakers, even myself, right, here and there, extrapolate what we saw in Vietnam or Brazil to stagnating regions in Africa. But that does not answer your general question, I admit.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. On the same idea, also, there's a question from the floor saying, why do we need more tinkering on that than in other policy areas or research area, I would say, with policy interest?
Yeah, so the tinkering, again, I'm trying to coin this term. I don't know if others have used it already. So what I mean by tinkering is that, try to summarize this briefly in the presentation. So it's more like a programming approach, right? So work with a program in a certain setting and try to improve the policy of this or approach of this program. I think this can certainly work, and this would mean some more like patience from the academic side also, to stick with the program, work with the program over many years, and do one study after the other in order to address the next policy question that basically emerges, right? So that's what I mean by local tinkering. And then under certain conditions, this might also be transferable to other settings. For example, like very similar countries, so neighboring countries with similar institutional settings, or whatever is relevant for, the impacts, for example, to emerge. But yeah, I think currently the paradigm in economics, at least, is to generalize like crazy, right? And basically claim that what we observe in, Western Kenya also applies to West Africa or even Asia. I think that's wrong in the first place. And then let's maybe work on something better, something more humble, if you will. And that's what I mean by local tinkering.
Totally agree with you, Jörg. So thank you very much. It is now time to also hear what it is, the message that Ignacio is going to deliver. So please, Ignacio, go on.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, let me do this. So I'm going to bring the regulatory perspective now to this debate. I must start to say, connecting with the presentation by Jörg, that I take for granted that universal electricity access is needed, no one left behind. Electricity is an enabler of development, of course, does not produce development by itself. And I think that for me, more like a practitioner from the viewpoint of regulation, the level of access is the question. So sometimes maybe too much access is provided when it is not necessary, but typically it's the opposite, right? So the question that I would like to address is this one: how can regulation help in accelerating electrification in countries that have a deficit in access, that have not reached universal access yet? And I'm going to talk, as Jörg had said, about the need to step up the effort because there is still a lot of people without electricity access. Try to identify what is the critical bottleneck. And I will, the spoiler is that I think that it's the segment of distribution, understanding by distribution the last mile, including both on and off grid, and indicating a flexible approach that departs from basic principles, that is more like a framework that is adapted to many situations, that we call the integrated distribution framework in the team that I'm leading both at MIT and Comillas University in Madrid, with collaboration also of the Florence School of Regulation. The custodian agencies, in the last report that was published just days ago in June, they say extraordinary measures must be designed and implemented to ramp up electrification efforts to the levels required to achieve the 2030 target of the SDG 7. And well, they provide the background information for that. So this is the report on the left that they have published days ago, the update of the previous one. So every year, by this time, they publish something, and then you have another reports that talk about the level of financing that goes to electrification. The results are the ones that you have there. They compare in this column on the left the indicators in 2010 and the latest data that correspond to 2019. You can see that in electrification, we have moved from 1.2 billion people without electricity to 759, in people without access to clean cooking from 3 billion to 2.6 billion, indicating that this is a tougher problem, and one that is progressing much slower. In the 759 million people without access to electricity, it is without any kind of access. So probably 2 times or more people have electricity without proper conditions, reliability, for instance, that is very important. And that could explain in some cases the reason that the access to electricity is not producing all the impact, all the benefits that it could be expected. Some sentences that I have taken from these documents are these ones. So in the first one, the world is not on track to achieve SDG 7. also that it is estimated that by 2030, about 660 million people will remain without access, and most of them, is the question that was asked before that we could address later, 85% are in sub-Saharan Africa. COVID has had a negative influence on access to electricity, and that means that we will have to increase the effort even more, and it will be necessary to have an access rate more than triple than what has been to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7 by 2030, and that means in sub-Saharan Africa only to connect about 85 million people each year until 2030. And well, the distribution is the same one, basically, that Jörg has been presenting. You can see the colors in light blue, everybody has electricity. In light yellow, between 50 and 100 people with access. In dark yellow, between 10 and 50, and below 10% of access in the country, those countries in red. And you have also with these blue dots, the 20 countries that have the most people without electricity. We have to think big to address this problem because the problem has a huge dimension. We know that population is not growing, even decreasing in some parts of the world, but not in these countries that we are talking about. And for instance, the UN has published in the latest findings that the population of sub-Saharan Africa is projected to double by 2050 from 1 billion to 2 billion people. So we have to have tools that are commensurate with the size of the problem. Any activity that will provide access to energy is welcome, of course, but we have to think that the problem has these dimensions and to look for solutions that are commensurate with the size of the problem. So for that, I think it's important to identify which is the major bottleneck for access and to focus the measures on that bottleneck. And we think that that is distribution. Although there is a lack of investment overall in generation and transmission, we know how to address the problem. We have independent power producers with PPA contracts in generation, and that has been done in all these countries many times. In some cases, too much, because some of the countries have excess generation now. The problem is more in how to get that generation to the customers that are blocked by insufficiency in the distribution network. And also investment is deterred because of the same problem in generation and transmission, because they don't have access to the to have off-takers to take that power, right? And this is for on-grid distribution. Off-grid distributions, these solutions are progressing very much. They could be deployed quick, but they have the problem that they will leave lots of people behind. The mini grids are expensive. They have to be subsidized by donors, otherwise they will not be economically viable. And the solar home systems, even with microfinancing and advanced technologies like pay-as-you-go, are only for those that can afford them. And that again leaves lots of people behind. If we look at the situation of electric utilities in those countries, but here I have only the slide for Africa, you can see that the revenues that come from the tariffs that are these circles that you see for each one of the countries, in all countries except for Seychelles and Uganda, are not able to cover the cost. The costs are these horizontal lines. In orange, you have the operation and maintenance costs, and the fixed cost, capital cost, you have in green. And you see that there are lots of countries that cannot even pay the operation and maintenance costs, not to talk about the investment costs. So that leads to a situation in which these subsidized tariffs below costs, they create a deficit typically in the distribution segment, because typically those revenues go first to pay for the contracts with generation, to pay transmission, and then the leftover, which is not enough, goes to distribution. So distribution is in a very poor financial condition, and they are not able to invest properly or to maintain and operate the system properly. Beyond that, moreover, what happens is that distribution in the rural areas is expensive because the demand is low and dispersed. And that means that the tariffs even incur in additional deficit when you connect more people in rural areas. All together leads to poor quality of supply, unhappy customers that defect, purchase diesel generators to have reliable power. They don't pay the bills, they connect illegally, and that increases the losses for the distribution company in a vicious cycle. So this is the reason why so little investment goes to, particularly private investment, goes to distribution. You have this chart that I don't have time to explain fully, but what you have there in the different columns on the left, you have the organizations that lend money, that invest in access in those high impact countries, the 20 countries that I was talking about before. Then we see whether the money is coming from international sources or domestic ones. Then we have here what is the type of financial instruments that is used, whether it is grants or it is debt or it is commercial or not, or it is concessional or equity. Then you have here whether the money is coming in the country itself through private or through public-private or through public sources. And then you have here the segments. You have how much goes to grid-connected renewables, a lot. How much goes to grid-connected fossil fuel generation, a lot, again. The tiny part that goes to transmission and distribution networks, and the even smaller part that goes to mini grids. So if we look at the and trace back what happens in this is the end consumption, and this is the residential one. You can see that in the residential one, tier 1 and tier 2, which is typically what the people in rural areas achieve as a first access, is very small compared with the total amount of money that goes to access. Most of it goes to the people that are already connected to the existing grid, mostly in urban areas. And then we can see that the source, as I said before, very little goes to transmission and distribution. And even more, if you look at whether this is public or private money, you see that most of that comes from public money and some from public-private partnerships, and basically nothing from private investors. So distribution is not attracting any private investment. How to crack this nut? How can we address this problem and get these 85 million people per year electrified in sub-Saharan Africa and also other countries? Okay, what our approach is to go back to the basics and look at basic principles and try to integrate them in an approach that in a flexible manner could be applied in any country. The 4 pillars are these ones: universal access, nobody left behind, first one. Second one, the solution, the integrated solution has to comprise both on-grid and off-grid solutions. Third, the business model has to be financially viable. If we need billions and billions of dollars coming to electrification, that should come from the private sector, and the private sector will not invest if the business is not viable. And finally, we have to do this, as Jörg was saying, the purpose is to increase economic growth and human development, and so the design should be addressing that with priority. So I will expand each one of these 4 pillars. The first one means that if we want to have universal access with nobody left behind, that requires to resort to some kind of utility-like entity, some sort of company or institution that will have the responsibility of providing access to everybody in a certain territory. That means that they have to be the default provider, maybe not exclusive provider, but default provider, so that they will go where and nobody else goes. They will have to be the last resort provider. So if somebody fails, abandons, quits, they have to take over, and should be permanent. So the design of the approach should be like a utility, should be forever, not a business that lasts 5 years and then disappears. The second pillar is that we have to integrate both on and off grid solutions. And that requires to plan what are the different solutions will go to the different areas of the territory that we are considering. And when I talk about integrated approach and integrating the 3 modes of electrification, I'm talking precisely about this. This is a piece of Uganda that in my team, we have been doing the electrification plan. And what you see here is that you have some wires, 11 kilovolt, and some wires, 220 volts, that is grid extension. But you see that the least cost solution includes the green areas that are mini grids and lots of dots that are standalone systems. This is the solution that integrates the 3 modes of electrification at least cost. This is the one obtained with the same computer model that will give you the solution connecting everybody. And that is certainly much more expensive. And then with that, with this type of geospatial computer aided tools, we can approach the electrification of entire countries, like this is the case for Rwanda, with the different colors indicating the different electrification modes. So we need a comprehensive electrification approach that starts with a techno-economic electrification plan. It is supported by institutions, business, and a regulatory model that it makes possible to have legal security and to facilitate investment. And we need, and that leads us to the 3rd pillar, a viable business plan, how to pay for it. We need a way to show that it is possible to cover the costs and to pay equity and to return the debt and to cover the cost. So it is necessary a financially viable business model for distribution. And the different approaches that could be employed, we think that concession, a distribution concession, it's the approach that could apply in most places. Why? Well, we have lots of examples of concessions. Some of them failed and some of them have been successful, but we have been able to learn from all of them. We have concessions for solar home systems, for mini grids, for rural areas, for urban areas, and most interesting for national utilities that integrate the whole thing. And we have several of them that are now current. The good thing about the concession is the flexibility in adapting to the situation. Given that it's a contract between the 2 parties, it will never be signed by, let's say, a private investor if the business is not attractive. And that means that we will forget a bit about legacy conditions, and we will be looking at this concession as a looking forward instrument that by definition should be viable. And because of the flexibility in the contract, we could include all these principles that I was talking before: permanence, last resort and default provider, least cost mix of technologies, economic viability, and this is the last pillar, the focus on development. We think that it is obvious all of this is done to promote economic growth and human development. And that means that the purpose is not only to electrify the residential sector. When I was working a few months ago in Uganda, and I was looking at what happens in the north and northeast part of the country, people are poor. And if you provide them with a solar kit that allow them to have 2 lights and a phone charger, the economic condition will not change. Do we call that access? Well, I think that access means that we have to include also community users and productive users so they could get out of poverty, because otherwise electricity will not produce economic growth and human development. So we have these four approaches, these four pillars, and we have tried to apply them in different countries at different levels with this project that we started some years ago with the Shell Foundation. We are working now with the European Union and the Rockefeller Foundation. So we could ask ourselves which countries are adequate for implementation of this type of approach. And we find, and that has to do with a question that I was in the chat that I will try to answer, that the situation after the power sector reforms in low-income countries is very diverse. Of course, I cannot spend much time on that. I will refer to these two documents. One is for the entire world, is done by the World Bank group, and the other one has been sponsored by the African Development Bank. It has been done by Professor Anton Eberhard at Cape Town University. So I will not spend time in the slide, but this is only shows, and you can go to the regional references, the diverse result of applying power sector reforms in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. In black, you have private investment. In yellow, you have public one, and then you have transmission, distribution, and generation. And whether they are together or they are separated means that you have unbundled the different segments, and you have a large diversity, but basically includes that you have liberalized only the arrival of private investment in transmission, sometimes in distribution, sometimes in transmission, very rarely in distribution, no competitive markets, both at wholesale level or retail level. Same thing for countries in South Asia. So we were looking for initially for Goldilocks countries, so countries that were just right. So the soup was not too hot or too cold, or the chair was not too large or too small, right? Like in the story of Goldilocks. But we have learned that these principles apply everywhere. The only thing is to apply them with flexibility, adapting to the specific situation. So we have been working in Colombia, Uganda, Rwanda, Nigeria, India, very recently in Ecuador, and we are planning to do that in other countries. We started, as I said, with working with the Rockefeller Foundation, with the Shell Foundation, sorry, and with the Shell Foundation. That has led to an interesting pilot, Conexa, that is running at the moment in the Kaduna province in Nigeria. We have been working with the Rockefeller Foundation and in these countries that I have mentioned, and also with the European Commission with a high-level platform for clean investments. We have produced some reports explaining how to apply these principles under different conditions in Colombia or in Uganda, for instance, in these reports that you can visit our websites, both in the Rockefeller Foundation and MIT, or the Universal Energy Access Group at MIT. And I am happy to discuss with you now in a few minutes. And then if you can send some emails or requests, I will be happy to answer also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for sharing all this very rich experience, as well as your enthusiasm in getting many solutions to the problem of energy access. I'm just seeing if there is there are questions.
There was one at the top that has been there since before we started.
Yes.
It's a difficult one, but I think that we can try to address it. So could you please make a review of the impact of the regulation IPPs on the access to electricity in sub-Saharan African countries? Okay, so as I said very briefly, the regulation has happened in a different way in sub-Saharan Africa that has happened in other parts of the world. not only in sub-Saharan Africa has been special. I think that typically low-income countries in which the unbundling has happened only up to a point. Most of the utilities continue being vertically integrated, and liberalization has not taken place. There are no competitive wholesale markets. The way in which private investment has entered has been through IPPs, as the question was saying. I would say that the regulation from the viewpoint of access has not had much impact. It has not fixed distribution. Distribution has continued as bad as it was before. And I say that I think that distribution is a major problem. Of course, unbundling of generation and allowing IPPs has brought investment in generation, not all that is needed by far, but in some countries, even more than is needed. So Uganda or Rwanda or Ivory Coast have excess generation capacity at the moment, and because of lack of transmission, they cannot export it, and because of lack of distribution, they cannot reach the customer. So we have to have a comprehensive view. So, well, the solution is a little bit disappointing. I think we have to do something special about distribution and something special about making possible that private investment comes to transmission with a template of how to do contracts, PPA contracts in the same way that we are doing that with generation.
Please, 2 questions, if it's possible. Thank you, Mr. Pérez-Arriaga. It was a nice presentation. It's me who tackles the question about EPPs. Because typically I see in Ivory Coast and in Ghana, you have a problem of the world structure market. These countries are considered as are advanced in terms of access to electricity. They have, for example, for instance, in Ghana, 80% access to electricity, but they sign too many advantageous take-or-pay contracts with IPPs. So now, there is a double dependence, a dependence in terms of energy. They use a fuel mainly, so fuel, imported fuel, diesel, etc. And the other dependence is the payments, because now we have a problem of payments, and there is a threat of electricity cuts in those countries. And those countries have no problem with access to electricity. Rural areas are settled at 50%, I think, access. So it's quite good at the scale of sub-Saharan countries, but they have a world problem in terms of the electricity structure. So we argued in 1990, we said, okay, the monopoly is not good because there is vulnerability, for example, for the hydro systems. And now EPP said, okay, we increase install capacity, but they create a double dependency on fuel on first, and a dependency in terms of the world tariff structure, take-or-pay contract. We've decided to open the sector, and what's gonna the solution? It's quite incomprehensible for the consumers, and it was very difficult to make a clear review on the impact of the access to electricity comes if the EPPs foster access to electricity or not. For instance, I just take one example. In Ghana, during 1990 and 2000, EPPs are introduced. And some reports said that due to the introduction of EPPs, access rise. But at the same time, Ghana developed, which we call the self-help electrification program, and it was a specific program to connect the poor population. But it's not related to EPPs. It's a complete different way. So we try to say, okay, IPPs foster access to electricity, which is not. So it's quite an important debate.
Yes, it's an important debate, and I think that as you have explained very well, some countries have fallen in the trap of signing expensive contracts, take or pay, with IPPs, overestimating the demand growth that was going to take place. So they have too much generation. You have fixed costs that you have to distribute over a small amount of energy, and you don't have the capability. Well, now in Ghana, because of the transmission projects that are being built, that could be alleviated, mitigated, but you have the problem of exporting that power so that the generation capacity and demand is more or less matched. You mentioned also that this program of electrification is also focusing on off-grid solutions. And I think that the solution has to be, as I said in my pillar number 2, has to be both. So you have to try to increase the demand that is connected to the grid, export power if you have too much, so that you dilute your fixed costs that are unavoidable. You have incurred into that. It is a take or pay contract, so you have to pay for the energy, you consume it or not. And on the other hand, there are the solutions for some other people that are far away. The best solution is mini grids and standalone systems while the demand is dispersed and low. So once that demand hopefully grows, it will make sense to connect them to the grid. You could also have some accelerated program, and the beauty of these computer models is that you can just, once you enter the data, you can play with them and say, okay, let's assume that we connect more people. And then you see how the tariff will decrease because you distribute over more energy what is connected. But I fully agree with you that it's a difficult problem that is jeopardized by previous decisions that have been made that now are costly.
Thank you, Mr. Pérez-Arriaga.
Thank you very much for this interesting debate. There are a few more questions in the chat.
Yes. I mean, I can
address them later on.
Okay.
Now I leave the floor to our third speaker, Federico, and then we'll go back to some further discussion.
Great.
So
Thank you.
thank you, Anna. I hope that you hear me well. And
We
so,
do. And we see your
okay, so I hope that you can also see the presentation. So it's always difficult to come third because might happen that the speakers before you, either they say very and more interesting things that what you're going to say, or because they anticipate things that you included in your presentation. In any case, I think that luckily enough, I have a somehow different point of view and different things to say that at the same time they of course connect and speak to what the previous speakers have said. So first of all, my presentation is going to be a bit different in the sense that I will be talking about my experience because as you can see here, I've been working in Africa in particular for the past 5 years with the Power Africa program and the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. So notwithstanding the fact that I still work in the academia, I've been doing this activity that has been really bringing me into the field and working a lot with politics and with the practical implementation of any well-designed and maybe more theoretical program. And therefore I was, and I'm still there, facing the harsh reality of implementing any measure or any policy reform. So just first one disclaimer. So everything that I'm saying is my thoughts, my ideas, and they do not involve nor Power Africa nor the Tony Blair Institute. But what I want to here just present is how the Power Africa Senior Advisory Program works. So it works at the intersection basically between the technical commercial aspects of the energy sector and the political side of the energy sector. And in particular, As we have seen, energy access is a very important issue everywhere, but particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, it is not just a very important issue, but it is, of course, a political issue. So there is the need to, let's say, I would use this term, translate technical studies and also technical reforms and commercial reforms into something that can be not just understood, but also supported and promoted by the local political leadership. And this is what the program does. So it is trying to help these countries by making the connection between the technical and the commercial aspects with the political decision makers, because in the end, all these decisions are taken by the political decision makers. And this is very important because it explains parts of the heterogeneity, and it explains why, I think, at least this is my experience, things might work very differently in different countries. So where I've been working, so as you can see here, I've been working basically where there is no electricity access or energy access, or very little. So it is in the Sahel region and bits and parts of West Africa, in East Africa, in particular in Sudan and Ethiopia, and then in Central Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I've been doing many activities that spans from big infrastructural projects such as Inga Dam or the OMBG interconnection, to supporting the Desert to Power initiative in the Sahel, and supporting the government of Burkina Faso for doing competitive procurement practices and developing tariff reforms. So these are, and you can see here that we are talking about countries where, apart from Senegal, I would say, they lag behind, of course, in terms of access to electricity. And in 4 or 5 years, nothing has changed. So hopefully I don't blame it on myself because of the fact that this energy access has not changed much. But you see that, of course, we are talking about countries where, for instance, Chad or Niger, we are well below 10 or 20% in terms of access to electricity. So what I would like to talk about is the 6 key issues that I find particularly relevant for cleaner energy access. Again, this has a lot to do with different incentives that donors, international financial institutions, and governments have, and the specificity of the political as well as the business environment that you find in different countries. So the first point that I want to raise is that the donor scale of preference in terms of actions and investments that they like to do is not always aligned with countries' needs. And you will see why. So a second point that I would like to make is that we must be aware, so beware of the OPEX trap. I call it the OPEX trap because sometimes it is difficult, if you come from Europe, for instance, to understand why there is a strong preference for OPEX-based generation with respect to CAPEX-based generation. Another point that I found at the beginning surprising, and then while working there, I realized why it is not that surprising if you spend time in Africa, is that the load curves and production profiles are not that relevant. And also, and that translates into different ways of thinking, for instance, power contracts. And then you realize how the tiny details, so the devil is in the details, so the tiny details of operational rules, technical requirements, and good market reforms can deliver more cleaner megawatts than renewable installations, for instance. A fifth point that I would like to make is do not forget natural gas, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And the sixth point, but which is behind all of the other 5 points, is that it's a lot about politics, and this has major consequences. So if all these issues, and of course there are more for sure, but I think that these are, to me at least, according to my experience, these are 6 very important issues that if are not addressed properly, they have straightforward consequences. So they reduce the energy access or the pace in which energy access grows. They lead to more diesel and HFO consumption. And of course, they increase the sale of diesel generators. And in the end, you can find a power sector that looks like the 2 pictures that I am sharing here. So I have to admit that before working in Africa, I didn't know that you could have a generation fleet. Okay, so these are cargos or ships that basically can generate power, and they can be deployed in less than 90 days, and they can provide up to 470 megawatts of power immediately to the grid. And so there is an important fleet, so this is the most famous one, that is routinely providing electricity to countries, and it has many positive issues, positive, let's say, sides, and that is why it is often deployed, and you can find it in different countries. It has been operating in Guinea, in Sudan, in Guinea-Bissau, and it's a very wide used solution in Africa. And of course, the other is the market for the diesel generators, and you have, of course, these are the small ones, but you have diesel generators of very different sizes, and I will show later on some statistics on diesel generators. So starting with the donor scale of preference, and here I think that I align myself a lot with what Professor Ignacio said before, is that working myself with an international organization and dealing with other international organizations, I have to say that there are 2 expressions that you always hear, and one is that we need a quick win, and the other one is that we need to communicate. So a quick win means that you have to show that the program is effectively doing something. And in terms of communication is that you have to do something quick that can be easily marketed to attract more attention, more funds, because also international financial institutions are competing for donors' money, or for, and within the same financial institutions, there are competitions among different programs in different countries. So quick wins and communication are very important, and I don't blame anybody for that, but just to keep this in mind, because it is very important. And so if you look at the list of things that are useful for the and all the energy sector and the electricity sector in particular, and access, you see that we go from generation, on-grid generation in particular, and then solar home systems and mini-grids, and then enabling environment networks, in particular distribution networks. It would be, of course, and we can do the distinction between transmission and distribution, and then cross-border power trade. So if we see how easy it is to, everything is difficult, of course, but relatively more easy in terms of quantifiable targets. So we see that there are 2 elements that are needed to improve the energy system of any given country. You have 2 that are difficult to quantify. So what does it mean to work on the enabling environments, which means market reforms, regulation, and the implementation and enforcement of regulation, making the country more attractive to the private sector? Of course, there are different metrics and different statistics, but it is much more difficult to quantify. I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm just saying that it's much more difficult to quantify targets with respect to renewable generation. We will install 200 megawatts in 2 years, okay? Very easy and very easy to communicate, by the way. And the enabling environment is very difficult, much more difficult to quantify targets and much more difficult to quantify communication. It is, then you see for networks, it's more difficult to have a modular budget. What does it mean? It means that to make any kind of investment in transmission or distribution, we have to deploy a lot of money. And these are very costly investments. And there is the risk of either having stranded assets, we were discussing this before, or there is the risk of a lock-in effect in terms of the activity of an agency. And so networks are very difficult to finance, particularly distribution networks, more than transmission networks, but distribution networks are particularly difficult to finance. And as you have seen, the private sector involvement in the networks is almost non-existent, and it is very difficult to imagine communications around networks. And what is even worse, again, from my experience, and I've been working 5 years in particular on many aspects, but one of the most relevant aspects is cross-border power trade. It is difficult to quantify targets. It is difficult to have a modular budget. It is difficult to involve the private sector. And of course, it is very difficult to elaborate cons. So you see, from my personal experience, that there are some things that are preferred by the donors. And that is why you might end up with too much generation. So it doesn't mean that if they prefer generation, they will invest only in generation, nor it doesn't mean that because they prefer generation, investments will be carried out, because it might be in any case difficult even to make renewable investments in a country. And solar home systems, and then mini grids, and then you see things that might not get done. Not because they are not considered important, but because they do not answer completely to the needs of the donors. And in the end, they are more difficult to implement because, as Peters was saying before, is that it might take much more time to work on networks, enabling environment, and even cross-border power. So I move to the OPEX trap. So we were discussing about the need of investments in distribution, or the need of investments, for instance, in renewables, and concession, and then profitability. And of course, I agree with all of that. Working in Burkina Faso, in Chad, in Niger, in Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, or in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I find that sometimes it's not that easy to build, okay, a financial structure for a long-term investment, because there are countries which are not in the position to sign long-term deals or provide guarantees for capex-based investments, either because they cannot access to debt facilities, either, as I said, because they cannot provide guarantees. And of course, it's never the utilities that they can provide guarantees, nor the utilities that can access debt. So in the end, you need a government guarantee, and sometimes not even the government guarantee is enough. And therefore, the financial engineering gets complicated, and it slows down the process. And if you add, most of the time, if they are fragile countries, they are fragile because of the fact that also there is political instability. And so any kind of business structure is very difficult to implement. And the more you push the thing towards capex, the more difficult it becomes. So for these states, the OPEX-based generation is the easiest way to manage generation on the one hand and public budget. So I'm not saying that it is easy even with OPEX-based generation, but it makes more sense because there is less need of guarantees, less need of structuring a complicated concession with complicated debts. And when you are in good times, so for instance, the GDP is growing more than expected, you are exporting more, and so you have hard cash, hard currency, then you can subsidize. And when there is bad time, you just don't pay and you have arrears. And arrears are pretty common. So we were talking about Ghana. So Ghana is in a peculiar situation that we can have a whole session on Ghana. And I cannot, but what I can say is that, for instance, there are one of the biggest problems for the electricity sector is that the public sector is not paying the bill. Okay, simply like that, and it is something very common in the African states. So, for instance, in the DRC, 1/3 of the electricity consumption comes from public buildings, and there is a reason for that. And the public buildings, they simply do not pay the electricity bill. And of course, that creates stress then on the producers and on the IPPs. And so everything becomes much more complicated. But so in any case, OPEX, subsidize in good times, arrears in bad times so you don't pay. And even from an investor perspective, and of course, you don't. In this case, you don't have to think about an international respected investor supported by the international financial institutions, but other types of investors. If I'm making an OPEX-based investment, I just sell the fuel somewhere else. And for instance, if I have the ship that I was showing you before, I can even go and navigate with my ship elsewhere. So it is something that it is very important to bear in mind, and I call it the OPEX trap. And we have to find ways to solve, okay, and not fall in the OPEX trap. So load curves and load profiles are not that relevant. So this is something that when you do energy planning and you model your power system, it is something that is very, very important. And I'm not saying that these are not important in Africa. I'm just saying that in many countries, you are in chronic undersupply. And because of the fact that you are in chronic undersupply, you run your power plants at full capacity all the time, and still you are not even close to meeting the demand. And so in this case, when you find yourself in this situation, and when you are used to this situation, then when you go and sign a contract with a new IPP, it makes sense for you to make a fixed payments based on capacity, because your idea is that I will use it all the time. So for instance, and this is so common that when you talk to politicians talk about megawatts. I want to buy 50 megawatts of power, either it could be a generation or it could be import. And at the beginning, I couldn't understand why they were discussing always about megawatt and never about megawatt hour. But then I realized that, for instance, if you're importing electricity, and Burkina Faso is importing a lot of electricity, and they talk about 80 megawatt of capacity from, or 120 from Ghana, and then you go and see the utilization rate, it's basically 120 megawatt all the hours of the year. So if you are in that framework, in that mindset, it is much easier for you to talk about megawatts and to talk about fixed payments, and to not care about the need of flexibility and variability, because you are trying to tackle chronic undersupply and load shedding. And so that is why I say that there are also more, in operational terms, they are more used to manage load shedding and chronic undersupply rather than operational risks for idle capacity or the procurement of ancillary services. So just something that I anticipate now, most of the power plants in sub-Saharan Africa, they do not have the technical equipment to provide spinning reserves. And most of the time, it's not even included in a contract. But all these things are things of so there are no rules in most of the African countries. You have no rules concerning ancillary services or not even losses. But this is because you are in a situation of chronic undersupply that, of course, because of the small size of the market, can immediately become, okay, a chronic oversupply, because you might, if you are in Burkina Faso, the peak demand is 300 megawatts. So if you add, so you are in chronic undersupply, then you add a power plant, a very small power plant of 200 megawatts, and you are in, immediately you move to oversupply for maybe some years, and then you're back into chronic undersupply. But this is very important to understand, because then you, if you get their way in which they reason, then it is easier to come up with solutions and to help them in setting negotiations for IPPs, for instance, or for power sector reforms. And notwithstanding the fact that donors, for many reasons, they prefer quick wins and they do not, they still acknowledge the fact that rules, technical requirements, and reforms are very important, and then sometimes can be more important in delivering energy access and, of course, in delivering clean energy access. So what we mean is that it is really important that so many countries do not have a grid code. So, and the grid code, I'm specifically referring to all the technical and operational rules to manage a network and to do all the power, the system operations activity needed. TSOs do not have visibility of real-time power flows. So for instance, in Africa, high voltage network visibility ranges from 60% to 0. And in Nigeria is less than 20%. So it means that, of course, they cannot carry out many operations in an optimized manner. And that explains also the fragility of the network and the need of backup generation for end users. As I said, most power plants cannot provide spinning reserve. And if it is not contractually required, the developers do not even invest in spinning reserve. So recently, hydropower plants built by the Chinese, okay, normally this is an activity that should be done by an hydropower plant, okay, so they do not have the possibility to provide spinning reserve. And so this is, again, is hindering the quality of the electricity in the network, and it is, again, requiring more backup generation. And at the same time, as I said, so all these technical requirements are very important because they are not very big investments, writing a grid code or implementing a grid code or providing some equipment to gain visibility on the network, or to add small investments to have spinning reserves. But this could increase by far the quality of the electricity and reduce a lot load shedding and the need of backup generation. And the same holds true for smart market rules. So I saw that there were some questions on Nigeria. So I do not specifically work in Nigeria because I have colleagues that work there. But in Nigeria in 2020, after probably 5 years of political debate, there was the introduction of a performance-based tariff reform. And the introduction of this performance-based tariff reform has increased grid-based consumption by 20% in less than 6 months, drastically reducing the use of backup diesel generators. So what happened was that basically, prior to the reform, companies in Nigeria, discos, so distribution companies in Nigeria, were losing money. So they didn't have any incentive in selling power because they were, for every kilowatt hour they were selling, they were losing money. So of course it was on the one hand the need to increase the tariff, but on the other it was not at the detriment of the poorer population. So this performance-based tariff was designed so that in order for the discos to get a cost-reflective tariff, the performance of the grid needed to be improved significantly, and there were standards of no interruptions, you know, the standard quality of service that we have in Europe, of course, then translated into attainable targets by the discos in Nigeria. And so what happened is that basically the price of electricity increased for 45 to 50% of the Nigerian consumers, which are the consumers that are well off, that basically can afford, okay? Because you have to remember that very low tariffs sometimes are like hiddenly subsidizing people that could afford to pay even a higher tariff. And in particular, they, as I will show you, they might even save money because they reduce the amount of diesel generation that they normally use as a backup. Again, another tariff reform in Burkina Faso is making mining companies considering switching off from self-generation to grid-based generation because it's a time of use. So the more sun power that the Burkina Faso is installing, the less there is the need of having just a single tariff, but it is possible to have a time of use tariff also because you will, I will not enter into the details, but the situation in terms also of load curve is not that relevant. Or another reform that has been introduced in some countries, and for instance in Senegal, is helping off grid equipment by simply having a VAT exemption, which is at the same time connected to quality standards for off-grid materials. So in order to get the VAT exemption, you have to purchase and import materials for off-grid that meet certain quality requirements, and again, quality requirements also for off-grid solutions are a very, very hot issue right now. So
I'm sorry to interrupt for a moment, but I think we slowly have to come to an end.
Yeah, but I'm coming to an end. So these are just the fifth point that I'm making, is that it's too early probably to rule out natural gas. So this is just a consideration that the power sector in sub-Saharan Africa, so excluding North Africa, but also South Africa, accounts for 0.22% of global emissions. So it means that even if we triple the overnight the current generation mix for Africa, it will still account less than 1% of global emissions. And at the same time, if we triple that, and of course we make the network more resilient and more efficient, we would increase emissions from the grid-based system, but we would dramatically reduce the use of gensets. And gensets are very harmful to people. And of course, this implies that because of the fact that the electricity demand is growing very fast, maybe less than what they optimistically claim in many expansion plans, but we say at an average of 3 to 5%. It is difficult to rule out conventional gas-fired generation. And this is again something very political, and it has to do with the international politics and of course with climate change, but this is something that cannot be ruled out. And the move towards the financing of just renewables probably is too fast. So here I just show a graph of the project mix of the African Development Bank, which basically in the past cycle of investments has basically gone almost to renewables, either in terms of hydroelectricity or wind and sun. And you see that the share of conventional has dropped from 85% in the 2010 to less than 4% in 2016. So if we do not address all this, we end up with diesel generation. Here is this is a very nice study done by the International Finance Corporation of 2019. And what I just want to highlight here is that in Western Africa, the total, so this is an estimate, of course, but the total expenditures for generator fuels is higher than the total expenditure for grid electricity. So this means on the one hand that the electricity, in Africa, they are consuming more electricity that we can measure because of the fact that they have backup generators, and they are spending a lot of money on generator fuels. So on top of the electricity bill that they pay a lot for generator fuels. And if you see the backup generator fleet, again, this is an estimate, but it's a very interesting estimate. You see that if you sum all the 14 countries, you get something that is not far from 20 gigawatts of installed capacity in terms of backup generator fleet, which is basically the same amount of on-grid power fleet that you have in Africa, which is more in West Africa, which is more or less 25. And in the DRC is the same. So I'm talking about countries where I've been working on. So it means that they are accustomed to having a very low quality of the network. And there is a flourishing market for generators. And if you just write on Google diesel generation Africa, you will see that many companies are making the case for diesel generators as the drivers of Africa's industrialization. So the market and the people, or if we do not address those problems, they will find ways of getting electricity, and they're already finding ways of getting electricity and creating a parallel market. So just to end,
just a final word to conclude, because we started very late and we have to conclude this session.
Yeah, so it's just the first two bullet points, and saying that anywhere in the world, but in Africa in particular, power is intertwined with politics, because controlling access to energy helps you hold on to power, if I may use this play of words. And at the same time, this is very important, that because access and electricity tariffs are on top of any government agenda, this implies that it's most of the time you have to talk about these issues with either the president or the prime minister. So this makes it very political, and you are talking to someone that doesn't know much about the sector, and it is taken in any case out of the hand of more competent and technical bodies. And I think that this also explains a lot what is happening in Africa, in the sense that energy is very technical and electricity is very technical and very difficult to understand. And it is better whenever you leave a little bit politics out of it, and you have more experienced technicians and regulators dealing with the sector. And of course, there are a lot of people that have these skills and qualities in all those countries. The problem is that the politics is too much involved in the sector. But this is important, because if you know it, then you know that all those stupid questions that you see there that I started asking, then after a while you stop asking all those questions, and you understand that it is better to find alternative ways to navigate the system. Sorry for being so late, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for staying with us. As usual, we have raised more questions and answers, and I invite also the participants to perhaps email us to continue discussing, and there will be also other sessions during this very rich conference that are going to address this difficult issue of access to energy and electricity. So thank you very much again, and sorry for the delay in the connection, and see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Au revoir. À la prochaine.
Thank you. Bye.